Hi, everybody. I'm Jan from the Holt Accelerator, one of the co-managing partners. I'm here to tell you a little bit less. Oh, it's starting to change automatically. Oh, I thought you were reaching for me. So yeah, I'm going to do more on fintech and more. I want to talk a little bit about the opportunity for your neighbors to the north. So I thought I'd give a little exposure of what's happening in Canada in this particular case. I will touch on a little bit of blockchain-related stuff at the back. But I thought more on the FinTech Week, I'd focus on FinTech. So just to give you a broad strokes overview what's happening in Canada right now. So we are seeing about 850 FinTechs across Canada, the bulk of which lands in Ontario. So if we're looking at the different provinces, within Ontario, you hear Toronto. I've spoken to a lot of you. The first thing they say is, oh, Toronto. So we're not Toronto. We're actually on the Quebec side, which is within Montreal. Montreal, that therefore holds the bulk of what's happening in Quebec, which is about 15% of the total FinTechs. And lastly, then you have British Columbia and Vancouver, so they hold the other portion of the majority of the fintechs in this case. So if we keep going and we look at sort of the deal flow that's happening, there have been some new numbers that are out there most recently, but if we look at last year, 2017, Canada falls roughly like 1% to 2% of the overall global deal flow. So it is a small piece of it. It's also relatively smaller. We are 10 times smaller than the US. And so that gives some perspective where we fit. Here are some of the bigger stories that sort of emerged. And so Montreal had Lightspeed. That was kind of the lion's share. It had like, did a deal like 166 million most recently. Toronto has a large amount of diversified fintechs that have been raising financing. So there were 6 that were above 10 million. So those are examples there. And in Vancouver, as we all heard multiple times throughout this event, CryptoKitties being one of them, but several others that had more on the larger than $10 million raised. I did want to point out sort of what's happening here. This is not exhaustive. I know there's significantly more in here. This is just some of the results that Traction had provided. I thought it was interesting because it's a good sample size. It's actually telling of what's happening. So if you look here, this is how many financial institutions are actually getting involved when they're actually making the investments. So roughly anywhere from 10 to 20%. And they usually come in much later, well, what I call later, so Series A and above. So it's rare that they actually come in earlier stages, so who's helping cultivate that? There's a lot of, in this case, accelerators or venture capital firms who are helping to create that next generation of fintechs and helping with that pipeline. What's interesting is there's an increase of family offices that are starting to take a look at this space. And I think that's very interesting to look at. I wanted to give one example. And so this is an example of the Desmarais example. This is, if you were to look at under the Power Corp or Portage and Diagram, these are sort of the companies for which they own. And you can see here a broad spec. This happened in the last 3 to 5 years, and they're just sort of collecting on these different categories that are there. Now, some would look at that and go, that's very interesting. It sort of starts to resemble a bank. Now, they're not actually doing that. If you were to ask them point blank, they'd say, well, that's just good investments. And it does make sense. Like, look at different categories, see where the opportunity is, and look to reinvent each of those areas. But as you can also see, it starts to, and they have been challenged on that. Are they going to become a challenger bank? And I think that's going to be a big opportunity as we go forward. I don't think it's alone in Canada. It's happening across the world where there's a wealth of financing available, and a lot of these family offices starting to say, hey, we're in finance. We should be also looking into this sort of space. And that will unlock a lot of new funds in this particular case. I did want to speak a little bit about the opportunity. So what is Canada and what's happening there? There's some interesting dynamics that are happening, so it makes it interesting to look to the neighbors of the north. So this is just a high level. Some of the banking system's a little bit different. I'm just going to concentrate on that for the moment. You can see these banks at the top probably account for like 90 to 95% of the banking activity, so it's a little different than what happens in the US. And in doing so, when they ask, who is willing to cooperate or collaborate with a fintech, about 88% of them say, yes, we want to collaborate, want to work with them. And about arguably 62% of them are already trying to do so. So you can see there's a gap, meaning they want to increase the amount of partnerships. And that's good news if you're a fintech, because for many of those fintechs, they need to partner with the bank to sort of unlock that next stage of growth for them. So that's a good opportunity. The challenge that's happening right now is there's a lot of what I call POC casualties. So there's a lot of fintechs that are going in looking to create a partnership with them. Sometimes these deals aren't win-win. The bank's going in getting very aggressive with it. The startup's just trying to be able to make that deal to succeed. They're not profitable in this particular case, and it actually hurts the startup. So there's no deal. It doesn't go from POC to implementation. The bank is happy because it got to learn a whole bunch and potentially had the opportunity to partner with someone. But on the other side, that's been hurting a lot of the startups. So we're hoping to see an increase in terms of implementation, but it's still a big challenge here, at least in Canada, that we're trying to break on through. So where are they all focused? They're all doing a range of different activities here, so I'm sure it's no different than what you're seeing here as well. But it's anywhere from running their own accelerators, partnering, like with, for instance, with the Holt Accelerator, we have a suite of full gamut of all the partners that you saw up there before. They do things where they invest in and take over other incubators, like what happened out of HSA, which is a university, and it's not a fintech accelerator incubator, but it's more of a general area. So just looking for startups. They just want to get exposure to startup activity and see if they can work with them or learn from that. And it's sometimes more of a philanthropic play versus actually looking to collaborate with them. Or maybe it's going to feed their clients down the line, but some of this is too far removed. What we're starting to see, though, which is very interesting, I think the most interesting opportunity is the strategic investments. So they're starting to say, hey, wait a minute, well, we have a VC fund available, most of them do. We're going to start making investments that for which solve our internal problems. Now, I don't know if it's going to actually solve the problem, but we're going to place bets. And we're going to see if we're going to place ones that make for good investments, but we're also going to see if, through a department problem owner, that they can actually create a POC and move on to implementation. So we're seeing that as kind of the best entryway of getting in if you are a fintech. International ambitions, a lot of them are starting to place different footholds around the world. We've seen them, whether it be in New York to San Francisco to Tel Aviv, and that's them trying to get exposure to new markets and look for new startups for them to partner with. Innovation labs, usually not big on POCs, usually hard to get into implementation. This is usually for their own internal sort of prototyping versus doing actual POCs, so it makes it a little more challenging. But anyways, these are the different avenues for if you are a fintech that you can look to see if you can partner with them. One of the biggest things here is that they are hungry to increase the amount of partnerships that's happening. All of them feel they are behind. Because there's less financial institutions, they're all sort of competing with each other. They all want to be number one, or some of them are the underdogs, which means there's a huge opportunity if you're a fintech to try and partner with them. On the other side of the coin, if we look what's happening here, it's not the first time to see this. There's multiple sources say that fintech development right now in terms of new companies being created is at an all-time low. So where do you get them if they're not being created? Well, you start looking international. And so hence why a big reason that I'm in New York right now, starting to try and find and scout the top fintechs, early stage companies that can start coming in and then work. But the other side of that opportunity is with those corporates. Another piece of this is that there is flushed with cash right now. There's probably too much financing, and so this is just financing that is in Montreal, for which they have headquarters, and are focused from seed to Series B. That's $500 million that's available, and there's not enough deal flow. Right? So again, if you now put those three pieces together, it starts becoming very interesting. I did want to talk about some of the research that's happening here. So yeah, I will flip at first. What's Canada quite known for right now is artificial intelligence. It does have the third largest concentration of data scientists in the world. There's been some really big announcements, and this has happened because through 30 years of development through the AI cold winter, eventually emerged the idea of neural networks and deep learning. A lot of it was under the guidance of a gentleman named Dr. Yoshua Bengio, and so therefore that team of groups of scientists who've been working on these algorithms for a significant amount of time have now since spun off and created new elements like Ivido, which was created, and that raised $100 million in government funding. From that, supercluster initiatives started being announced, like Scale Up, for which Ivido is very much connected to. And then most recently, there was, if you may have seen, an organization called Element AI, sort of sprung up out of nowhere. They raised a Series A, closer to, I think, 100 million US, 150 million Canadian, and it was like 10 data scientists with a big dream under Yoshua Bengio in this particular case, and they're pushing to raise their 250 million Series B, which would be the first technically unicorn in fintech in Canada. We don't have a lot of unicorns. And so these are the opportunities on the AI side that's really emerging. On the other side, because this is a more blockchain-focused event, some of the activities here, some would argue that Canada is positioned as a leader, still behind some of the other major markets that are out there. And some of the things that we've seen here are like Project Jasper. So this is a government project led by the Bank of Canada, for which they implemented to use daily settlements in this particular case. So that's been in the third iteration of it. Ethereum, with some of the founders being based within Canada. We've seen things from the Concordia University, a department by a professor by the name of Jeremy Clark, who's been focusing on helping build something for a regulatory body, the AMF, working on an order book using blockchain technology. So there's a whole bunch of other activities that are starting to happen that are emerging, that which is very interesting because that means there's new hires available and staff available to then plug into these new blockchain projects, because let's face it, finding blockchain-related talent is very difficult right now. And the last piece that I just want to touch on is that it can be 3 times less cheap, or get 3 times more out of your financing if you were in Canada. And one of the biggest reasons is the development cost. You can get up to 85% of any product development subsidized by the Canadian government. Your dollar can go significantly further. I'm talking, $1 is now equal to 1.3, so that's 30% better. And in many cases, Montreal, just as a comparison, is 50% cheaper cost of living relative to New York. So I've actually experienced this where I've been on a team that we went through Y Combinator, and people thought at first we were crazy because our staff was 3 times larger relative to others in the same sort of field. And then we found out the budget was the exact same. So some of the opportunities that are there. And this is where the Holt Accelerator fits in. Just a quick plug on what we're trying to do here. So yes, the first and foremost, we're trying to get you those partnerships. That's what I alluded to in the very beginning. So we have a suite of partnerships across the board, and we're just trying to push POCs right from the start. We have all the right decision makers to be able to do it, and we can get introductions with the executives to make this happen. On the other side is, yes, funding. We do provide financing to get it off the ground. There's a whole bunch of capital calls that could be made by our VC partners, and we have VC partners across North America because we want a diversified cap table that's in this when we go to help them build their products. And lastly, on the product development side, we do have an AI lab that we're partnered with. It was actually one of the companies there, Strategy AI, and we do have some support, some blockchain partners to help us build out any sort of the tech plays that we have. So that's sort of how it allows us to capitalize on that big opportunity that's available. That's pretty much it. So thanks very much for your time.